This section is entitled In Search of Stability, and here we will cover several areas. We will look at the political patterns of the past in Africa. We will also talk about slavery on the continent of Africa. Oftentimes, people think about Africa, and I know at the beginning of class, one of the descriptions we talked about was how coup prone or war torn the continent is, and we'll talk about that. Then we will talk about colonialism in Africa and the history of colonialism. In the video, the crash course video that you're to watch as a part of this week, also you'll learn more about the Berlin Conference and how it began the colonization of Africa. And then we will conclude with some thoughts. This whole title and concept is taken from one of Mazrui's videos, but we will talk about the future as Mazrui saw it with relationship to Africa, post-colonial Africa. So we begin by discussing the political patterns of the past. And we know that both state and stateless societies existed in pre-colonial Africa. Often there was not a lot of attention paid to stateless societies. Part of the reason is because historians place a lot of emphasis and a lot of priority on written records. And we know that there were, in many societies, the presence of written records were not there. However, don't want to negate the fact that there were very, very powerful records of oral heritage in those places, being very, very rich and deep and very long. The griot in many cultures, who were people who were repositories of a particular group's history and their way of making sure that they were able to retain long records of history and genealogies and all of that. Is a fascinating aspect of Africa that is very often overlooked and certainly not appreciated in the way that it could. But as such, the distinctions that normally are made when in anthropology and in history and things about historic and prehistoric and historic, being the absence of written records and the presence of written records, is not really a helpful discussion when it comes to Africa because of this. When we talk about stateless societies, we're really looking at those ways and those places where people came together. Those societies were ordered along lines of kinship, certain types of ritual or other means, oftentimes age group, but those were where the order and the way of doing things had its basis in that. It was a stateless society. There was no centralized government, and oftentimes it was termed as government by discussion, because the way that groups solve problems is they gathered together. Oftentimes it would be the elders, or it may be a certain group who had relationships, kinship lines again, who would come together and make decisions. In your book, Things Fall Apart, we see evidence of a stateless society where the people would come together and the elders would make decisions and talk about things, and decisions will be made in that way. When colonialism did come to the continent of Africa, one of the places where there was resistance and a defense against it were those lineage systems that were a part of these stateless societies. And in many cases, they represented significant challenges to the efforts of the colonizers who came in to try and institute certain rules and certain rule within African cultures. State societies, the state being if we think about a centralized place of power as opposed to decentralized place of power, where there's sovereign authority, sovereign jurisdiction over a given territory, it being able to enforce that through the use of physical force within its boundaries. In Africa, you have some very elaborate empires, including Songhai, Mali, Ghana, Egypt, Kush. You had some very powerful and elaborate city-states, including pre-imperial Sokoto and also Zanzibar. Interestingly enough, in the southern region of Africa, those state societies were few and far between. One very notable exception, though, was the Zulu nation, which was a very powerful one. And we know, of course, and there's discussion in the Asante text about Shaka Zulu and the advances and that it represented there. But that is a very notable and standout example of a state in southern region of Africa. If we turn now to a discussion of slavery, slavery did exist in Africa for a long time. That's something that we know. But it was practiced in a way that was different from the chattel slavery that was practiced in the West. People who were enslaved in many African cultures were people who were either conquered in war or because they owed some type of debt or they were doing some other way of repaying or some type of compensation. And so they served for a while as slaves to particular people. And we see that again in the text, the Things Fall Apart text. Again, another difference is that slavery in African practice tended not to be a lifetime practice. That after a period of time, a person would gain their freedom. Many times they would end up marrying into the family that they were spending time in servitude to. If there were children that were born, whereas in Western practice of slavery, if there were children that were born to an enslaved person, they themselves became slaves. That was not necessarily the case in the African practices of slavery. It was different. We know that slavery had a very dramatic impact on the population of Africa. In the video, another video that you'll be watching, the video that you'll be watching about colonization, they talk about the estimates there being something in the neighborhood of 12 million people who were removed from the continent as slaves. And that had a long-term effect, not only in terms of population, but also the advances in the industrialization that would have taken place and could have taken place on Africa had not those vast amounts of people been removed and all of the other consequences as a result. There was also a factor of slave trade that was taking place in the Indian Ocean at the time that interplayed with the West African slave trade. As slavery became less efficient, it started to dwindle and ultimately became illegal in the West, though there were still attempts to keep it going in terms of extracting slaves from Africa. But it still existed for many, many more years in the West after taking slaves out of Africa was in effect banned. We move to the military-civil pendulum in Africa. When oftentimes when you have civilian rule that tends toward anarchy, and this is Mazrui's take on this, then he said that what often would arise would be military rule that would come to check the anarchy that was taking place as a result of civilian rule. And as the pendulum swings to the other side, Civilian rule would often come into place to check the tyranny that was a result of military rule, and tyranny centralized political violence in the pursuit of governmental ends. So Mazrui poses the question, why is Africa coup prone? And he has several answers to this question. He talked about how there tended to be a technology of destruction that was placed and had priority over a technology of production. That you had many interests, particularly outside interests, that had a stake in military rule and maintaining a foothold in Africa, and who were eager to sell and supply military weapons and other means there. So that became priority for many places. He also talked about that you had a lot of African institutions that were relatively weak, but the strong one was the military. So that's where a lot of the action, so to speak, came from. Also, within the armed forces, what Mazrui termed a low level of professionalism. You had people who were trained, but the lines of command weren't always respected or followed, and so there oftentimes was unrest within the military ranks, and that spilled over into people taking over and making attempts to take over and all of that. And finally, Mazrui talks about boredom in the barracks. You have all of these trained soldiers, fighters, you have all of this equipment. So what are they going to do with it? They're constantly drilling, and at a certain point, the unrest in the barracks becomes such that it spills over into people actually putting these things into action. But Mazrui also points out that there are some conditions that are resistant to coups, too, as a matter of fact. One of them, those places that had one-party states tended not to see coups very much. And also those Islamic societies where Islam acted as a centralizing force, coups were not very common in those two conditions. So now let's turn to a discussion about the impact of colonialism. And there are a couple of schools of thought, and we'll examine those now. The question whether colonialism was a cost or a benefit to Africa. The Epic School of Colonialism maintains that it was an epic period in the history of the continent, something that was seemingly unchangeable. Some of the things that they talk about as a result of colonialism, that colonialism incorporated Africa into the world economy, ignoring the fact that it was already had been a major player for a long period of time. Also, the idea that colonialism resulted in Africa entering into the sovereign state system. Again, the devaluing, he talked about it being a Eurocentric viewpoint, though, because it ignored the powerful state systems that were already existing in Africa, and also the power of the stateless societies at getting things done. There are people who maintained that colonialism helped to incorporate Africa into world culture, that the major ideologies and these again European ideologies of liberalism, capitalism, socialism, Marxism, communism, fascism, all European ideas, but the people who maintained that these were things that were became important because of colonialism on African soil, that the European dominance in the fields of values and norms became important, and also the importance of European languages in Africa as those colonizing countries took over various parts. They're incorporating their languages into those particular areas, being a part of that. There are people who also talk about the incorporation into international law with regard to colonialism. Also, the information flows within the continent because often what Africa knows about itself and about different parts of each other is influenced by the West. So, very long, you had the news organizations and any type of news about other parts of Africa came from the outside rather than within the continent itself. And then the moral order that people oftentimes who are proponents of this idea of the effect of colonialism, that it brought in a type of moral order, particularly when we look at Christianity, asking questions and imposing the idea of whether or not a man could have more than one wife, or if things with it when it comes to paternity and all of those ideas that were very different from the way that paternity was looked at in traditional Africa. If we move to the school of colonialism as episode, the take here is that Africa could have entered the world economy and the international state system without colonization. The idea that because of modern science and technology, it would have converted the whole world into a global village, and it would have also happened in Africa rather than subjugating the continent. Also, the idea that European impact on Africa was shallow rather than deep, that it was transitional rather than long-lasting, that the capitalism there was shallow, and it was really more based on Western consumption patterns than production techniques, and the fact that Africans very often were not the ones who were the producers of things, even after colonization ended. Still, the means of production were controlled and owned by the former colonizers, being something that continues to be the case in many parts of Africa. But in conclusion, when we look at these two schools of thought, Mazrui comes to the conclusion that European colonial rule was more effective in destroying indigenous African structures than in destroying African culture itself. And I like to end with a final discussion that he talks about, which he calls a celebration of decay. And he asks, and looking around, particularly once the colonizers' grip loosened on Africa and they left, his thing was that he felt as if the ancestors were angry. And why were they angry? As he says, what he calls a dis-Africanizing of Africa, where there was a turning back on the previous centuries of tradition and culture and all of the things that are there, that there was ignoring of cultural continuity that took place on the continent, people turning their back on the previous centuries in the attempt to modernize without consulting cultural continuities, always being willing to change, the loss of cultural identity in pursuit of becoming more like the West. All of that Mazrui saw as evidence or contributing to the anger of the ancestors, as he calls it. And he talks about how the results is an instability and a war between the indigenous Africa and the forces of Western civilization, which results in a crisis of inefficiency. And a couple of examples that he liked to use was, first, you have Canada coming into parts of Africa to grow wheat. And you had African countries and presidents who were eager for this to happen, welcoming this in, ignoring the fact that the wheat that's grown in Canada and the type of soil it requires is very different from the soil in the African countries where they made this attempt, and it ended up causing severe and long-term damage to the soil in those places because it was just not suitable. And so that being an important thing. And so these are some things that he looks at when he talks about, often when people looked at post-colonialism, the decaying structures and the decaying infrastructure that was a part of Africa. So he then asked the question, so how does one turn the tide? One would be to rethink the past, the present, and the future. He says to look inward and take into the fact that there's cultural feasibility that can be a consideration. To turn again to the traditions of Africa and let those inform and guide things that happen there. And in that way can reshape society anew and look outward, that Africa is a part of the global village and can create a modern and future Africa that incorporates the best of its own culture.